Sam Darnold played his best game of his career against the Atlanta Falcons with 5 touchdowns. But was it enough to have the Vikings reconsider his future? There's one element that could change everything that we haven't talked about yet. So let's do that now. The Minnesota Vikings were dominant on Sunday against the Atlanta Falcons, putting boots to butts at the end of the game and won by a final score of 42-21, doubling up the Atlanta Falcons. And they did so after the Vikings were tied with the Falcons, 21-21 at the end of the third quarter. They scored 21 points, 14 of those off of turnovers to be able to get the win, and they took advantage of everything that the Atlanta Falcons gave them. But kudos to them. The offensive line played extremely well and did not allow the Vikings defensive line to get much pressure one bit. Now, the one interesting thing about this Minnesota Vikings team is the fact that you have Sam Darnold. 1 year, $10 million contract. Is he going to be the guy long term? I don't know. But I can tell you one thing. He is playing like an MVP candidate. We talked a couple of weeks ago here on this channel about the fact that Jared Goff was getting all this MVP buzz and Sam Darnold was not, while Darnold's numbers were better, both in underlying metrics, PFF grades, big time throws, and even the baseline stuff like yards, completion percentage. They were all on par or better than what Jared Goff's was, despite Goff being around a plus 1,100 favorite to win MVP and the Minnesota Vikings quarterback being at plus 9,000, a significant gap in the betting odds, but not when it comes to production. So where do we go from here? Where do the Vikings go? It was reported earlier on the Vikings have not yet discussed a contract extension with Sam Darnold, which, I mean, it makes some sense. He's in the midst of the best play of his career. He's still in the sample size that he's going to be judged on when he does get that contract this upcoming March. But will the Vikings give it to him? I still think it's below a 5% chance that they do bring him back. But there's one element that could net the Vikings a lot. If Darnold leaves in free agency, he's going to count as a third-round compensatory selection in that process. But what if they don't let him leave in free agency, but they still get rid of him and they still move on to J.J. McCarthy? This is where the franchise tag can come into play, and that's where things get really interesting. Last year, the conversation shifted around T. Higgins being franchise tagged and then traded. What if the Vikings did that with Darnold? They do have the cap space being projected around $75 million, and the franchise tag per over the cap is projected to be $41.3 million. So the Vikings could theoretically shop him around to other teams, and they could end up trading for Sam Darnold instead of just signing him in free agency. Why would teams want to do that? Can't they just go get one in the draft? This is one of the weaker draft classes when it comes to quarterbacks. You're going to have top names that could be in discussion for first-round picks, and who probably shouldn't be first-round picks, go back to school. It's essentially going to be Cam Ward, Cheddar Sanders. If you have one of those guys, then you're fine. But what if you can't get one of those guys? What if you pick 8th? What if you don't have access to being able to select one of those guys? You may have to try and get a guy like Darnold and hope he can continue this magic that he's done with the Minnesota Vikings. So what does that get him? If you sign Darnold in the free agency, it's 2 first-round picks. We dealt with that when Lamar Jackson technically became a free agent under the franchise tag, but nobody wanted to make a move, which was, let's just be honest, he's now a 2-time MVP that was dumped by the rest of the National Football League, but it worked for the Ravens. So the Vikings tag him and somebody wants to sign him to a big deal, go ahead. The Vikings will take your next 2 first-round picks. That sounds great. But maybe teams will want to get a little more creative. And hey, we'll trade you for the rights to Sam Darnold. Then we'll sign him to this massive contract. Maybe it gets the Vikings 2nd and 3rd round picks. That sounds a lot better than a 3rd round compensatory pick. And it fortifies the Vikings draft position this year, considering they're only guaranteed to have 3 picks and they're about to get a 4th with a 3rd round compensatory pick they gained by losing Kirk Cousins. So maybe a franchise tag is the smart way to go about it for the Minnesota Vikings. And if they do end up netting more than a 3rd round compensatory pick, they also could get way more than that. Maybe it's a 1st and then some because multiple teams are bidding for his services. Yeah, and you know what? If it doesn't work, the Vikings can absorb a 1-year, $41.3 million contract. Is it ideal? No. But you could also play Darnold, not have to worry about J.J. McCarthy. Yeah, would it stink to lose a year of team control and an inexpensive quarterback? Sure. But you have a guy that's already playing like a great quarterback in the building with your team. Theoretically, that's sustainable for next year. And especially if the Vikings end up making a deep playoff run, maybe it's sustainable long term. Franchise tag is probably the best bet right now for Sam Darnold for the future of this franchise, whether it be keeping him or getting a big return from another team who's desperate to find that quarterback of the future. We'll know in February whether the Vikings choose to pursue this route, but they probably should. And at the very least, strongly consider it. I'm Tyler Forness with AZ Sports. Skol Vikings.